Good evening. I'm Jim Renacci. Many of you have known me as I've traveled the state. I was a U.S. congressman, but our goal tonight will be to talk about Ohio. It's going to be to talk about Ohio's budget and some of the issues going forward with a budget that was just passed by the House, the Ohio House, just the last few days. So I'm excited tonight. We have a great guest, Greg Lawson from the Buckeye Institute. Greg's been on our program before, and Greg, welcome aboard.
Hey, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to chat, and it's always fun because we get a little bit into the weeds on policy. It's what us think tank folks like to do, so it's always a pleasure.
Well, it's great to have you, and that's really what I want to talk about. Look, we just passed the budget in the state of Ohio out of the House. It's amazing because I used to say that previous budgets were the highest budgets ever, but now we have in my opinion, I'm going to ask you to confirm this, but this appears to be the largest budget in the history of Ohio. It also appears to be the largest increase in a budget in the history of Ohio and the largest expansion of Medicaid since Medicaid expansion. And since we are the number one state for Medicaid spending, it's a little troubling when you say those facts. But would you agree or disagree with some of those comments?
Oh, generally, it's true. I mean, the reality is that all this federal money that has flown into the state of Ohio has really jacked up the budget. It's jacked up the state budget. It's jacked up a lot of local government funds. Another thing that's happened is essentially, as a result of the combination of federal spending and inflation, we end up with pretty high sales tax revenue, which has meant that our state taxes have been coming in like gangbusters. And so what you end up with is it was estimated going into this budget when the House first started hearing debates that we were going to have a $6 billion surplus of just general funds that come in from the major state taxes. And so, that's part of what's spurred a lot of this spending is that basically there's money. There's a lot of it is one-time money. And I think what you've heard a lot of over in the State House is that there's a desire to try to make one-time investments that are not things that would be ongoing programmatic costs, but things that can make a difference here and now and today. So while we've got this opportunity, in some people's minds, opportunity, I think there's better ways to spend a good chunk of that money. You mentioned Medicaid in particular, and this is one of the great challenges. Ohio obviously expanded Medicaid under Governor Kasich back in 2013, and we've seen a steady march up the mountain in terms of people that are enrolled. We saw a really dramatic increase in Medicaid enrollees. Obviously, again, during COVID, there was a lot of federal rules associated with how you basically can get people onboarded into Medicaid. They essentially made it very easy to get people put onto Medicaid. And they also enhanced the match, meaning the federal government actually put more money into the Medicaid program, and the states were drawing it down, and Ohio was no exception. The challenge, of course, now is we've got over 3 million people on Medicaid in Ohio, and we're an 11.5 or so million person state. So we have an exorbitantly large number of people in the state of Ohio that are on Medicaid. Now we're beginning to go into a process where they're going to unwind some of this because a lot of this was tied into the federal declaration of emergency that was associated with the pandemic. And so just literally in the last couple of months, we've been moving towards ending that pandemic because of some of the decisions made in Washington. The Republican Congress pushed to end that. And eventually the Biden administration, I think, saw the writing on the wall about that. And that's going to create quite the challenge for the state of Ohio, because now we've got a series of folks that have been put onto Medicaid that probably are no longer eligible for Medicaid. And they're going to have to go through and do a whole bunch of what they call redeterminations. And this is a really cumbersome process, a complicated process. And it's actually it's done at the county level as opposed to it being a state thing. So the state provides some assistance, but county folks are actually caseworkers, are the people who actually make the determination on who's eligible and not eligible. So I'm very concerned about what this is going to mean in the long run. And the dollars are there, and the state's now going to have to start to pick up a greater share because the feds are going to start pulling back their enhanced rate. And that is going to be a real challenge. And, there's also been some decisions that were made in this budget to increase some of the, basically to put more money into reimbursements so that some of the workers, particularly in long-term care and home care, like visiting nurses or nurses and staff that work in nursing homes, get pay increases because they're having some problems, which on one hand, that probably makes sense at a certain level because there's greater competition in the labor force for these workers. But the other problem is that's a direct competition. If you're going to put money in over here for a certain set of the population, we're going to have to do something about this massive population we have in folks that are more often than not able-bodied individuals. So we're not talking about the people who are availing themselves of those kind of services. And that is where the rubber meets the road, and it's been a challenge in Ohio ever since we expanded it. I remember actually testifying and talking to folks and stuff when the initial Medicaid expansion happened, that this was going to be a problem. We were going to have a real conflict between able-bodied younger adults that should be working and being able to get into the private insurance market versus those that truly were not able to do things like the aged, the blind, and the disabled, which is a whole category in Medicaid. Those are the people that folks, I think, understand Medicaid is really geared to trying to help because they are the ones who don't have resources and are in the most need. But now we're going to have a real hard time managing this entire process as time goes on because the money is not going to be there. The cup is not going to continue running over because DC is going to, if not turn the spigot off entirely, at the very least, they're going to start turning it off at least slowly, and the money is going to start trickling rather than flowing.
Well, one thing we know, the federal House of Representatives just passed a debt ceiling bill where they want to try and claw back some of this money, which is also going to be interesting. So if they did have the opportunity to claw it back, wouldn't that hurt the state as well?
Oh, potentially, yes. And I mean, this is another, I hate to sound like crying over spilled milk. I mean, now we're talking about a policy decision that was made, a decade ago with the expansion of Medicaid. But at the time, I remember saying this multiple times, that this would be one of the most challenging decisions that the state of Ohio ever made, and would really put Ohio in a tight spot because you couldn't always guarantee that the feds were going to come through. That was always the justification, or at least one of the big justifications for doing it in the first place is, they're going to send us more money and we're okay with that. Well, they've done that. And now the threat is, to your point, if there is a clawback, and obviously we don't know what's going to happen as we go through the legislative process, but if there is, that could leave a hole. Absolutely, that could leave a hole in the state budget, and a big one too, by the way. We're not just talking like a small thing that can be easily smoothed over. We're talking about truly substantial issues there. And I think we should be concerned about that. And this is why we need to be able to work towards having a sustainable and pro-growth budget over time that is careful in where we're making those spending decisions and very smart about what we're doing with tax reform to get the state back up and running again. And, I'll say there's a few smattering of policies in the House budget that we would agree with that are positive in some school choice areas. They've made some positive moves, but this is a budget that we are very concerned could be structurally unsound. Maybe even in these two fiscal years that the budget is for, but certainly when you get beyond the next couple of years, it's not clear to me that we're not going to have to make some really dramatic, maybe even draconian decisions about spending in a future budget because we've overcommitted ourselves now.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's one of the reasons why I left Washington. I get so tired of legislators spending money because they have it. All right, so we now have it. The federal government has attached a 6-inch water hose to a 2-inch with a 2-inch adapter to a spigot, and the water is just flowing. And the legislators are saying, "Let's take it." The problem is, it's federal money, it's taxpayer money. Let's assume they don't claw it back. We know that that was a House-passed bill. The Senate's probably not going to do it, but in the end, I think these legislators and this budget has set up the future generations, our children and grandchildren, but also future legislators, future governors, future elected officials are going to have to deal with all of a sudden, we're going to have to pull back. And by the way, Greg, one of the things that's always bothered me, our budget's the same size budget as Florida, and Florida has twice the amount of people. And yet, Ohio legislators, the governor, nobody thinks about that. They always say, I know what they're thinking internally, I won't be here when the problem occurs. But this is just a sickening amount of spending in my mind. It's something that we should be looking to give back to our taxpayers. And when somebody says, oh, it's one-time spending, show me government spending that's one-time government spending, it just doesn't happen. So we know we've got this massive budget. Again, I think it's something I'm hoping more and more citizens of Ohio realize these legislators and this administration is spending our children's money down the road. Now, I want to go back and pick up a couple things you did say. We have 10 or 11 million people in our state. How many people are on Medicaid today?
Over 3 million.
So almost 30% of the people are on Medicaid. That's unacceptable and scary. That is clearly, clearly scary. And we all know we've got this massive sized budget, but our population isn't growing and our businesses aren't growing here in the state, which are the drivers of revenue. You said one thing that I think is so important too. Sales tax are going through the roof. By the way, they're going through the roof everywhere. You know why? Massive amounts of COVID dollars have been pumped in to states and cities. My local city is a perfect example. Wadsworth, Ohio, which used to be sitting on $8 or $10 million, is sitting on $80 million today because of COVID dollars. And what are they going to do? They're going to spend it. They're going to say, we're spending it on one-time projects. But let's face it, we know that's not the case. So let's talk about some of the good things in it. I mean, look, in any budget, there's good things. I still think the spending is bad, but maybe you can go down the road. Let's talk about education. I know they've done some things in education. What are some of the highlights that are in the budget on education?
Well, I think the first thing is school choice. They did increase the availability of the largest voucher program in Ohio called Ed Choice. The Buckeye Institute has long been favorable towards expanding school choice. In fact, even and really, and especially in light of the learning loss that students have suffered in the wake of the COVID school closures, which has been massive. That's not a unique phenomenon to Ohio. It's happened everywhere, but it's certainly afflicting our students here. We have been pushing for quite some time since the pandemic to maximize the opportunity for getting resources directly in the hands of families, directly in the hands of parents who know what individual needs are of their children, and so that they can find the right fit for their students. And so, we've seen some increases in the Ed Choice voucher in the previous budget. I'll give Governor DeWine some credit here. He increased. We have to, right now, you are eligible for an Ed Choice voucher if you make up to 250% of the poverty guidelines. And what this would allow you to do is take that voucher and go to a willing participating school, and it would act as your tuition. So it's to be able to pay for your students' education there. Then the initial budget, they increased it to 400%. That was the governor's proposal. The House actually increased above that to 450%. So I give a congratulations. We're appreciative of that. However, while that is definitely, I would say, a step in the right direction for empowering parents and putting students first, not just funding the system, not just funding, the school districts themselves, but funding the actual students. But because of all that money that we have, and because of what we know families are clamoring for in terms of wanting to have options available at their fingertips, we think they need to go a lot more than that. 450 is good. It gets us to a large chunk of the students here in the state of Ohio, but we should be getting to a point where we're saying, look, people are putting their own tax dollars into the state. They're paying the income tax. They're paying the sales tax. That's where the lion's share of school funding dollars comes from. Are those kind of basic taxes? People should get some of that money back. And if they're going to do that, and we have $6 billion, we should be doing two things with that surplus. First of all, we should be doing a bigger tax cut, which we can talk about in a minute. But two, we should be doing more to maximize school choice. And we could do a lot more than 450. We could probably get to pretty much universal school choice here in the state of Ohio. And we could, and not only that, other states are doing this. This is a chance for Ohio, which used to be a school choice leader, to stay on track and to use this golden opportunity. Florida is doing it. Iowa is doing it. Arizona is doing it. I've seen Indiana was just moving in this direction, where we're getting into universal either education savings accounts or vouchers. And while again, 450 is good, glad the House did it. There is so much more that we can do. Now, I'm a little hopeful here. I think the state Senate wants to move the ball forward. And I think the Senate has a desire to move in that direction. I think leadership has a desire to move in that direction. We're certainly going to be talking to folks and saying that you need to do this because this is too golden of an opportunity to just let it slide by. That's helping families and helping families directly, and not funding a bunch of systems, not funding a bunch of education bureaucrats. It's, again, making sure that families can choose what's right for their own individual students.
Let me ask you a couple of things. I actually met with a private school this past week that will get none of those voucher programs. So, even though we have school choice, it's not across the board. You cannot take those school choice dollars, what you are paying in your taxes, and use them for 100% private school. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on what the schools want to do. So there's some variability in there. So if you have somebody, I believe it's if you there's I forget the exact threshold, but there is a threshold where if you're below, then the school that accepts the voucher would have to use the full would not be able to charge in addition to the amount of the Ed Choice voucher is.
That's
And
right.
then
They
if
would have to accept it.
yeah, they would have to accept it in full if they accept it, and some schools choose not to, because they don't want to do that for a variety. And there's a lot of reasons why different schools are in different situations. Now, if you move up the income ladder, so to speak, and you're a little bit higher and you're still eligible, you can have to pay the difference basically between what the voucher covers and what the tuition might be. So some schools, don't want to deal with that. Some families can't do it, but I will still say this. So you're right, that is a challenge, and that's why in the long run, I think that what we really need to do is make sure that everybody who wants a voucher can do that, and that gives you 50. Well, actually, it's a little more than that now with the way the school funding formula is operating. But for the families that are in the higher end, that still is a big assistance to them, because obviously it's a lot different if you only have to pay a couple of $1,000s per kid versus paying $9,000 or $10,000 per kid. That's obviously a big difference. So we're still a big advocate of it, and getting as many resources into the hands of the individual families. But there's going to be a few challenges there. But this is another reason why we need the charter schools in the state of Ohio. There's some provisions in the budget that get some additional dollars into the hands of charter schools that have a history of showing good outcomes on test scores and academic outcomes. We think that's a smart thing. There's a little bit more money in there for charter schools to be able to have some additional dollars to help them with their capital costs, because a charter school is still a public school, but they don't, unlike a public district school, they don't get any local dollars at all. They only get the state dollars, and they don't have access to any of the facility money that the state helps provide for buildings. So charter schools are designed to be a little bit different than district schools, do things a little bit differently. I don't think they should be funded 100% at the level that the district schools are, because they have some regulatory relief. So we don't support that. But they are I think they only get about 75%, and in some cases less, funding as a traditional public school does, yet they're a public school themselves versus a district school. They need to get a little bit more funding so that they can pop up and we can have good providers with different models showing up, so that also expands the school choice universe. So it's about vouchers and universalizing that. It's about making sure that we can have innovation in the charter school space, but that does require some funding. And from our perspective, that is, again, creating a broader base of education providers and an ecosystem that allows families to be able to pick and choose things that better fit. So there's some good things in the budget there. It doesn't go far enough probably in that space. And frankly, I think they plowed so much money into the traditional funding model in this budget. They're actually over $1 billion of new general revenue spending that they took from some of the governor's proposals, and they redirected it and they put it in here for that. And a lion's share of that is going to go to district schools. And I think A lot of district schools are sitting on incredible amounts of funds. A lot of it's those ARPA dollars and federal dollars that have come in from COVID that they haven't all spent yet. And now they're getting more money from the state through the funding formula. And by the way, some districts are guaranteed to get the same amount of money this year that they've gotten before, irrespective of whether they've lost enrollment. So this is one of the things that you don't see in charter schools, and you don't see this in private schools. They don't get paid if they don't have students in those seats. Public school districts can get paid for students that aren't in those seats anymore because they're on a guarantee. We were supposed to fix that with the funding formula, and that hasn't happened yet. So that's another place where we're spending money. We're literally spending money on phantom students in a wide range of school districts.
You know, Greg, I was just down in Texas. They don't call them public schools anymore. They call them government schools. And I think it's a good analogy because schools have now become like the government. I want to go back to the school funding. It sounds like there's some good things in there, but we didn't really get to the backpack bill. I mean, what was in the traditional backpack bill, you can take, the money and go anywhere with it. We really don't have that. We have not gone that far at the state yet, correct?
That's right. I think that we are kind of grappling our way towards being closer to that, but we're not there yet. And the backpack bill is a little bit of a complicated bill because we're big fans of what's called education savings accounts, and that's actually what the backpack bill has. These are actually better in the long run than vouchers, because what this allows families to do is exactly what you said, Jim, which is you can take it where you want to go. You can also disaggregate some of the spending. And if you say, hey, I need some additional tutoring, or I need an additional class, my student particularly excels in a particular language or a particular coding thing, and I don't have that in my district school, maybe I get a lot of what I need there, but I need this extra thing to be able to really meet the skills that my student has and to refine them and help them be able to move forward in what they're best at. An education savings account would give you the flexibility to be able to do that. So that is, in a certain sense, the holy grail, I think, of school choice, is to be able to have something like that. And you are seeing that emerge in other states.
Right.
This is the problem of Ohio, right? Even when we're doing things that are good, and again, we are moving pretty good on some of the school choice stuff, but we're still behind where some of our other friends are. Again, I mentioned earlier, Arizona's passed a universal education savings account legislation. Iowa has actually done that. Florida just recently did it. Utah, I believe, did it. And so there's a series of these states that are really, really moving forward very aggressively. And from our perspective, the least that we can do in this budget is go to universal vouchers. I think that's a good step. I think that's a necessary step. And then we need to continue having these other broader conversations so that we can get to something that is more like what a full backpack model is, because what this is all about, and what I find so frustrating, is this is really about putting students first. It's not about helping the systems. We say fund the students, not the systems. We are in a point where you can choose your entertainment packages. You can put on Roku and pick and choose your channels. And people demand that now. People demand to be able to do what they want to do in their private life. But yet we're moving a little bit away from it. But in general, we still are kind of stuck in a 20th century model of everybody having to go and take whatever the government is putting on their plate.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why you're going to continue to hear me say government schools, because it sounds like the government schools actually did pretty well in this budget because they got guaranteed revenue. They're already sitting on some COVID money. I want to make sure the listeners hear this again. The state's revenues and much of the surplus, other than the COVID money, is really from sales tax. And it's sales tax because there is so much COVID money in the system and so much of this excess money in local governments, county governments, universities, and our state, that we are spending this money, which is generating the sales tax. But Greg, you have to admit, when that money all dissipates, sales tax are going to get back to where they normally have been, and it's not going to be the numbers that we have today.
No, it's not going to be the numbers at all. And, this is where you have to have, I think, more pro-growth policy. You know, one of the things that also is frustrating about the budget is there's a lot of, and there are a lot of, I mean, there's smaller dollars. I mean, it's a million here, a million there, but eventually you start talking about a million here and a million there, and you're talking about real money. And there's tons of like projects. I mean, this was like a mini capital budget, which is where you go and fund a bunch of individual projects from individual districts. And I mean, I get it. Lawmakers have people back home who come back and they want certain things, and sometimes these are not even bad things. You know, they're fine to fund. If you have local resources that want to do it, and that's what local taxpayers want, then let local taxpayers make that decision at a local level. But what we're doing here is we're using state money and again, these surplus dollars that aren't going to be there for the long run. And they're saying that's using it for one-time spending. Well, yeah, it's using it for one-time spending, but is one-time spending on a choir thing or a arts building in one particular jurisdiction really something that's going to be the right answer in the long run? Or would it make more sense to actually plow that money into an effort to continue to lower income taxes, to make Ohio a better state from a tax standpoint? I mean, we could get ourselves a lot closer to a flat tax in this budget if we were putting more of those kind of dollars into reducing the tax rates than we were putting it into a bunch of pet projects.
Well, one thing I would tell you, Greg, I've done a lot of work with the Tax Foundation in Washington, D.C. This state can never get to a flat tax unless they get their spending in line. Their spending is so far out of line that what we learned when we went through this modeling with the Tax Foundation is that Ohio's spending doesn't need to be increased to 93 or 94 billion. It needs to get back to the 60 billion range. And then a flat tax really works here. So I'm not sure what we can do to get there, but at some point in time, legislators of the future, governors of the future are going to have to say, to make this state more tax friendly, we're going to have to get our spending in line. When we are spending as much as Florida, who's twice our size, that's a significant problem. I got another question to ask you about the education budget. I heard this from a legislator. I want to see if you can confirm it. I think it's $30 million. It was $30 million put in to do a study to show that government schools, that's my new word for public schools, government schools do a better job than private schools. Is that a true statement?
There is a provision in there that is, I think, needs some work because it's basically looking at doing a comparison on testing and things like that between private schools, or at least schools that accept the vouchers, is the way I understood it, and the public schools. And the argument that they made is that this is so that we can get an apples to apples comparison. But I think that there are some problems with that perspective because there's a lot of differences in how you do it. And some of the tests that some of the while you have to meet some of the state standards, you may not use all of the state testing, so you have a hard time doing that. And at the end of the day, I think what I find very concerning about that is that I worry that isn't really meant to be an even-handed approach to things, but is really meant to potentially be used as a gotcha kind of tactic in order to say that, oh, look, you know, these schools don't do as well or something, which I don't think is really how things will come out if you look at it in a fair way. But we have to look at how the Department of Education operates, and do we have folks who can put together the right kind of mechanism, and frankly, should we even be spending the money at all, which I think is brought about by I think it's probably somewhere in that range. I can't remember the exact appropriation, but I know there was one that was made to be able to develop one of those kind of tests. I think that's a conversation that my own view is we probably don't need that at all. I don't think we need to spend the money on that. And I don't think that that's as helpful. I think that what we're saying with school choice is parents generally will know best what they want to do, and they should be able to make those kind of decisions with those tax dollars that they are able to use when they take advantage of a voucher.
Well, of course, whatever the number is, I would agree with you. Studies are a waste of money, and I heard this was pushed by the teachers union. Who knows? I mean, again, it's one of those pet peeves that I see and that I hate in government is that we spend money to make certain groups or certain people happy. And at the end, what we should be doing is making sure that we're getting that education package where it's allowing children to go where they need to go. So, and parents making that decision. So in summary, on the education side, yeah, there were some good things done, but we did not move as far as we could to the backpack bill, and we still have a lot of work to go.
Yep. No, this budget is basically there's some okay things in there, but it's a missed opportunity. It's a very expensive budget that doesn't make. I mean, we wanted to see a much bigger tax reform than what they ultimately did in the budget. I think that is going to be a problem. In fact, I think the way that the tax cut that they did put in is structured is actually problematic and could create some long-term problems. So the bottom line is, we had a chance to give taxpayers more money, maximize the opportunity of families by expanding school choice dramatically. And while there is an expansion in there, it's not as much as we can afford and should be doing right here, right now, given all the challenges we have in the education space. So, I look at it and I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Of course, the House version isn't the final version of the budget. I think it's going to go through some pretty dramatic revisions in the Senate. I certainly hope so. I think there's, in particular, again, on the tax side and the school choice side, we need to really maximize this opportunity to do that and not be spending all this other money on all these other kind of pet projects and a variety of those kind of things, not on tests that are trying to be aimed to play gotcha with our private school partners. And that's what we need to do. That's what we need to see a budget that makes more sense, and then get us back on a diet.
So we've talked about a budget that we know is a record budget in the state of Ohio, a record increase. We know that in Medicaid, we've expanded it again. We've got a new expansion of Medicaid, which is many dollars. 3 million out of 10 million people are now on Medicaid. It's going to hard to claw that back. Education, we didn't get as much as we really would like to get when it comes to a backpack bill. We've got some things in there. There's two other pillars, of course, in a budget. There's incarceration and prisons. Can you just tell me what
Sure.
happened there, and was there anything done?
I think that's actually a space that they didn't really do a whole lot of anything innovative in that space here. It's actually something we've worked on in the past. Now, frankly, not as much in this budget. There have been some policies in previous budgets that I'd say were helpful in the sense of trying to help make sure that we're not spending money on people who shouldn't be incarcerated. And sometimes that's a bit in the eye of the beholder, but we do spend a lot of money on people for basically using, narcotics or things like that when they really need to be treated. And we're ended up sticking them in the prison system, which is expensive, one, and two, sometimes makes them worse off because they come out of prison and they're actually in a worse place than they were before they ever went in, which creates opportunities for them to be recidivists and go back in. So we need to have a little bit more policy in this space. This has been a challenge in Ohio, moving policymakers there. So I don't think there was much innovation on that side. It's more of a by the numbers kind of situation. And I'm worried about the prison thing too, because while it's a distant third compared to Medicaid and the education spending, it's still a big chunk of the budget, and it's going to be on an ongoing basis if we don't figure out how to do it. You build a new prison is really expensive here in the state of Ohio. We don't want to have to do that. So we need to make sure that we are putting the right people in prison. And frankly, if there's people that are in there that need more treatment than incarceration, we need to be able to redirect dollars out of there into those kind of options. And I think Ohio has tried to do that, but I think we're behind the pack. I don't think we're as innovative as other states in that space at all.
How about roads and bridges, the final pillar of spending? Anything that you could touch on there?
It was a pretty average one. I mean, they put a lot of money in for the Brent Spence Bridge there in Cincinnati. A lot of that was federal money that got kind
I
of
was going to say that was federal dollars.
it was, and so it kind of parachuted in. I mean, granted, that bridge does need some work, and we understand what needs to happen there, and the feds are providing some assistance. I think we weren't fans of the gas tax increase a few transportation budgets ago. We still aren't a big fan of that policy. We think that was more than what was needed in order to take care of the core things and to update the roads that we really needed. I think that's still generally the case right now. So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a bad transportation budget, but I'm not sure that I'd say that it necessarily is anything more than about average. And sometimes I think that we need to spend more on making sure that what we already have is up to snuff, as much as sometimes expanding certain things. There's a lot of stuff in the state, unless you're building in central Ohio right now, where there's still a lot of population growth. Why are you building a bunch of new stuff rather than making sure that the old stuff works?
I would agree with you. Now, talk a little bit about, we know we've got this House budget. just for the listeners, the Senate now is going to do their thing. Just kind of a rough idea of what's going to happen over in the Senate and how does that work. They could actually rip this thing apart and come
Oh,
up with
yeah.
a whole new budget.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it could be a completely different budget. I mean, and I think that there's going to be substantial changes. I mean, you don't know exactly where it's going to land, but I know from talking to some folks over in the Senate, they really want to work more on some of the tax issues. I don't think that they were happy with where the tax plan landed in the House, and I think that they also want to move far more close to the universal on the vouchers. Again, we'll see what they come up with. I think those two policy areas in particular are going to probably be better coming out of the Senate. I'm not sure what the aggregate spending is going to be, and some of the Medicaid side of things is a little bit of a thorny issue because of some of these provider payment issues and some of the issues there. But I definitely think we're going to see a better tax and school choice package. And frankly, that's kind of what we're working on the most at the Buckeye Institute right now, because we want to be pro-growth with the taxes, and we want to maximize school choice for families. Those, I think, are the two priorities. There's a whole bunch of other smaller things in there, but if we can move the ball substantially, up the hill and make big improvements, I think we'd be much happier than we are sitting here today. And I don't want to oversell it, but I really do believe that we're going to have a better product probably coming out of the Senate. Of course, the challenge with that is that's not the end of the story either, because
Right.
then you have to go to the House Senate Conference Committee and they have to hammer out the differences. So the more the Senate changes things, the more points of difference there are between the two chambers. And then the more negotiation there is, and challenge it is. And by the time it gets to that point, it's a lot harder to know where it's going to land because there's not as many people involved.
So I'm going to go to 30,000 feet now on the budget. We're spending massive amounts more money. We're cutting taxes because I did hear one of the legislators said, well, we did an income tax cut. Well, there is no way you can afford to continue to raise spending and cut taxes because you need the tax revenue to be able to pay that increased spending. Now, we all know that some of that payment is coming in, is already here because of the federal overload of COVID dollars. We also know that because of the federal overload that we have sales tax that is booming right now, but that's going to end soon. Our income taxes are low, but we've done some things in a budget that cause property taxes to go up as well. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, there's actually a lot of work in the property tax space, and I believe there's actually a study. Speaking of studies, a study to look at how we do property tax in Ohio, which actually might not be a bad thing because Ohio is in dire need of some reform at the local level. One thing I guess I didn't mention earlier, but I think we've talked about this. I think previously is a lot of money that the state does spend actually kind of passes through to a lot of the local governments if you think about it. And so one of the things is it's going to be hard for Ohio. I think this is a big difference between Ohio and Florida is Florida's local government structure is way different than Ohio's. Um, if we don't restructure how we do some things at the local level, we're going to constantly be spending money. I mean, for example, that it didn't make it into the budget, but if you recall, there was a big flat tax bill, House Bill 1, that was introduced, and one of the ways they were going to pay for the income tax cut was to get rid of what they call property tax rollbacks. This is a literal subsidy of state money, state general revenues that come in from the income and sales tax and certain business taxes, and is reimbursed to local governments for local levies to the tune of about, I think, $1.8 billion in each fiscal year, actually. So we're spending billions of dollars of state general revenue for local levies that are being done at the local level. That's a lot of money there. I mean, if you were to like not do that, you could actually cut the income tax pretty dramatically. And so we need to look at how we do that. Property taxes is like just so brutally complicated because there's issues around how you do valuations. There's tax reduction factors that goes back to legislation from the 70s and how they adjust stuff. So there's a whole smattering of issues with it. But here's the bottom line. I think for us to really get a grip on some of the, not Medicaid as much, but on some of these other spending issues, we're going to have to tackle some of these local government things. Is a study committee going to help? Blue ribbon task forces are made to gather dust on shelves sometimes, and that's, I'm sure it's true in Washington and it's
Oh,
true
sorry.
been true here before. Excuse me. But we need to really wrestle with that because we're never going to be able to deal with some of these spending issues and look at all more like Florida if we don't actually wrestle with some of these local government issues. But lawmakers don't like to do that because a lot of them come from local government, and a lot of them don't want to do it because honestly, it's complicated, it's very technical, and it doesn't give you the headline numbers of going and doing a big state income tax cut or doing some of the stuff that way. And it's hard work, but it's something that really needs to happen. I know I went off a little bit on that, but I think that's actually one of these issues that not enough people really talk about. You're one of the few people actually who I remember having some extensive conversations around how we do local taxes in Ohio and how bad that is,
Sure.
and the municipal income tax and all that stuff.
Well, when you're a CPA, you pay attention to all this stuff pretty closely. I've been a practicing CPA for almost 25 years in Ohio, so I get it. I get it. Hey, Greg, overall, how would you rate this budget? A, B, C, or D, or F? I don't want
Well, I probably a C or so. I think the spending really drops it, and I think the lack of the full tax reform and the school choice. I think the school choice expansion helps it out a little bit. But we have these revenue surpluses. They need to go back to the people, so they're not spent, or when they are spent, they're spent in direct ways that are empowering individual families. That's not really what we got, and I think that's a challenge. Could it have been worse? Yeah, they could have not put any tax cut in, and they could have not done any kind of expansion to school choice, and that would have definitely been a worse budget. But there's a lot of work that needs to happen here for this to be what I would characterize as a really good budget.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, you graded it better than me. I so worry about the spending that I give this a D budget, and I've got friends in the legislature. I still think whenever you're spending this kind of money, comparing it to other states, and you have this massive of an increase, I fear for our children and grandchildren. But again, what we're going to do is we keep pushing the can down the road, and someday it's going to come back to haunt us. But I want to thank you. I'd love to have you back after the Senate does their gamesmanship on the budget and do some comparison and see where we end up.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll end up in a better place. I certainly hope so.
I hope so as well. So I want to thank you again, Greg Lawson from the Buckeye Institute. I appreciate your insight. I appreciate you being on. There'll be a lot of this thing will be pushed out to many, many Ohioans. So hopefully they'll get an idea of the budget, what's happening in Ohio, and the concerns, and also some of the spending. As I said, as I see this, we have now grown Medicaid, expanded it even more. We didn't get all the education things that we needed. And in the end, our state's really living off of COVID dollars and, in my opinion, the sales tax related to all this spending. That's going to come to haunt us someday, but we'll have to see when that day is. So thank you again for listening tonight. We look forward to seeing you all again on our next podcast.